Okay, welcome everybody to the sixth session of the Virtual Kant Congress, celebrating Kant's tercentennial year. My name is Andrew Chignell. I'm on the organizing committee, and I'm very happy to introduce the chair of today's panel. The panel is being curated by the North American Kant Society and is featuring, in some sense, the USA part of the North American Kant Society. But I'll turn it over to the chair who can explain that and also give us some further details about the event. Let me just say that we are recording this and that these meetings do go up on our VKC website and YouTube channel. And we invite people when they can to leave their cameras on so that the speakers aren't speaking to just a bunch of dark panels. With that, I'll turn it over to Robert Cluis, who is the current vice president of the North American Kant Society.
Okay, thank you very much, Andrew. So I welcome you all to this session of the Virtual Kant Congress with a Cosmopolitan Purpose, VKC. So this session is sponsored, as Andrew just said, by NACS, the North American Kant Society, of which I'm the vice president, and Daniel Sutherland is the president of our society, is also here. I'd like to thank, first of all, Andrew Chignell and Katerina Kraus, who are the NACS tercentennial chairs this year, for their help with organizing events for Kant's tercentennial. And that also includes Andrew's work as co-organizer of this virtual Kant Congress with Karen de Boer. And so thank you also, Karen. I also want to recognize the organizational assistance provided by Luis and everyone else behind the scenes. So it's my real pleasure to host this event. Today's session is built around the three NACS prize winners for 2023. So in other words, work on Kant in North America today. We wanted to give each winner a chance to present some of their work. So perhaps I should say something about each prize. I'll begin with the Marcus Hertz Student Essay Prize. So this was won by Martina Favaretto. Since 2000, this prize has been awarded annually to the best graduate student paper presented at one of our regional study group meetings. So Pacific, Midwest, Southern, and Eastern study groups. Now under the Wilfrid Sellers Junior Scholar Essay Prize, this was won by John Walsh. And this prize was first awarded in 2010, and it's given annually for an essay on any topic. And the goal of in Kant studies, the goal of the Sellers Prize is to provide recognition to and support for emerging scholars in the early stages of their careers. And then finally, the NACS Senior Scholar Prize, this award was won by Helga Varden, and it represents the capstone of our architectonic system of prizes. And it's awarded for an outstanding article or book that is concerned with any aspect of Kant or Kantian thought. So article and book prizes are offered on alternating years. And this year, 2023, was a book year. I should just say something very briefly about NACS in general. It was founded in 1985, and it aims to promote scholarship and research, the building of a global community, and the exchange of information for all those interested in Kant, whether researchers, teachers, or simply Kant enthusiasts, whatever their backgrounds. So while primarily centered in North America, and thus representing, for instance, Canada, Mexico, the US, and the North American islands, NACS welcomes members from all areas of the globe. Okay, so the procedure today will be as follows. We'll just follow the order announced on the website. So Helga Varden, and then John Walsh, and then Martina Favaretto. So there'll be about 30-minute presentation with 10 minutes Q&A immediately thereafter. So hopefully about 40 minutes each. After all three give the presentation, we'll stop the recording. You're warmly invited to continue the conversation afterwards informally. And also we invite you to keep your cameras on if possible. So Helga, we're very excited to have you here and look forward to hearing what you have to say.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here. Thank you so much for inviting. And of course, thank you so much to the North American Kant Society for the wonderful prize and for your interest in my book. And my book was, as perhaps many of you know, it's called Sex, Love, and Gender, Kantian Theory. And so it is a Kantian theory that is very much concerned also with feminist philosophy and LGBTQIA lives. And so it was quite wonderful, I think, not just for me, but for all of us who work in these areas, that the North American Kant Society thought this is important work. So thank you very much. Since I was invited to talk about my book, I thought I'll talk mostly about the book, but a little bit also with the topics that I've been working on after the book. So my book, as you know, is called Sex, Love, and Gender. But I'll also, if I have the time, about 30 minutes. So if I have the time, I also want to talk a little bit about race. Generally, I would like to talk or share some thoughts about how I believe both in Sex, Love, and Gender, but also in the the book I'm currently working on, which is I tentatively called Transforming Our Social Contracts. So it's trying to give a new type of Kantian legal political theory that includes some of the concerns that I had in Sex, Love, and Gender, but now more broadly conceived, including some of the other isms, so sexism, racism, isms like that. Some of them as how we imagine or how we can theorize it so that perhaps the world we leave behind can be a little bit better in these regards than the world we have inherited. So before I start giving you some arguments or some thoughts about how I currently think of this, let me tell you a little bit about that book. So the book, when I wrote it, so I came to Kant studies around, I don't know, late 1990s, maybe, somewhere around there, mid 1990s, maybe. But I started my PhD studies in 2000 at the University of Toronto. And Kant studies that was, by the way, the heyday of, when Ernest Weinrib and Arthur Epstein were doing their groundbreaking work on the doctrine of right. So that was exactly when that was happening, which was wonderful. And I think an enormously important addition to Kant studies. So prior to the doctrine of right, as you know, there was a lot of Habermas, there was a lot of Rawls, some Hannah Arendt, but also a lot of Kant study was quite in practical philosophy was quite dominated by the groundwork and critique of practical reason. In fact, those were the works that originally Habermas, Rawls, and Arendt used when they were thinking about Kantian philosophy. So part of what was very exciting about that new movement starting around like late 1990s, early 2000s, maybe we can call it the Toronto School, to give them some due credit, was the way in which they made available these resources in Kant's doctrine of right. In my book, that is very much present, especially present in the second part of the book, which deals a lot with right and then also with justice. And so I use a lot of the arguments that are available in Kant's doctrine of right once reconsidered, so as to make it a theory that I think we can justify. So it also deals with things like why not only straight people should have a right to marry, why it's important to have a right to marry. It deals with issues like abortion, sodomy laws, but also sex work. So the second part of the book tried to then re-envision Kant's arguments from the doctrine of right, especially so as to envision how we can use those resources without being sort of stuck in Kant's own isms. So in his sexism, in his heterosexism, and so on and so forth. So that's the second part of that book. The first part deals with a different aspect of Kant, namely what I loosely will call moral psychology or phenomenology. So there was an attempt then to engage a topic that wasn't really engaged in Toronto or anywhere else, which had to do with how to re-envision the human being, or the fourth question for Kant, what is the human being? But also then with regard to the issues of sexuality and being a woman. So as you know, perhaps very many of you know, it is especially when Kant moves into anthropology, and when he moves to talk about actual societies, that his isms are particularly prevalent and particularly horrible. So I tried to go, well, first I didn't think it was possible to do with Kant for a long time. I didn't think it was possible to do it in Kant because of the way in which I experienced the tradition as correctly portraying Kant, or as the only way to portray Kant, which was that the aim for human being is to become like the sage, and the sage is fundamentally a person who is always does the right thing because it's the right thing to do. So a deep emphasis on maybe I can say just a way of arguing that really is the reflective, self-reflective capacities we have in abstract conceptual thought that really is the meaning or the highest good for human beings. And so all the other things, the heteronymous stuff, is not really valuable, and at most give us like challenges to overcome. And so there isn't much value in our animality on that type of view, or any value in a certain sense. Our bodies are like a bag of bones that can give rise to temptations that we should try and fight back or overcome. And our social self too doesn't really have any distinctive value. So part of what I did there is to try and re-envision that, to try and I went to a book that Kantians didn't read much, namely at that time, The Religion. And then I used Kant's account of the predisposition to good and the propensity to evil to try and re-envision how a Kantian can argue with those philosophical resources what a human being is, such that we end up with valuing animality and social aspects, which is naturally central if you want to give an account of both women's lives, but also, of course, LGBTQIA lives. Put it differently, one big puzzle, if you want to do LGBTQIA studies, is that being denied the opportunity to be yourself, LGBTQIA, is internally associated with heightened temptation of suicide, that you cannot find a way to live as who you are. And so the option of ending life becomes real. So if on the traditional Kantian or more orthodox Kantian view, animality is at most a bag of bones that gives rise to dangerous temptations we should overcome, then of course there isn't much to contribute from Kant studies to LGBTQIA lives. And I wanted to give a new way of thinking about it that I think is deeply consistent with Kant's own writing, even if not his prejudices, such that no, the highest good really is to pursue happiness within the boundaries of morality. Happiness does have value. It has contingent value, not non-contingent valued, or conditional value, not unconditional value. But the aim of earthly life is to become, or the human aim of an earthly life is to realize was animality and our social being in such a way that we can also both flourish and morally own what we are all about. So the first part then gave a theory of this. In what comes now, I'm going to focus mostly on that. I think I have about 20 minutes left. So I'm going to focus mostly on that, and I'm going to emphasize one way in which then on this account we can do racialization and also racism, and perhaps link it to some of the challenges I believe we have in modernity, namely a challenge we with Hannah Arendt can call a challenge of alienation. So it's trying to show one way in which Kantians can re-envision what the inheritance we have, predominantly have anyway, in Kant studies, so that we can also contribute to the challenge we have at the moment of overcoming modern alienation. I'll come back to that slide. So if we look at the predisposition to good in human nature, as we find it in the religion, you will see that Kant, which many people for a long time didn't know, including me, when I came into Kant studies, and for a very long time when I did Kant studies, didn't know anything about. Namely, Kant does have an account of a sort of a threefold account of human nature. And he argues that, and you find it in the religion, and he argues that one way to think of this is to think of the human being as having an animality, a humanity, and personality. I was re-envisioning how to think of the human being with regard to LGBTQIA and women. I very much used these philosophical resources of Kant's. How to do it? When a long story, quite quickly told, it goes something like this. So when we are born with what Kant calls associative thought being prominent. That is, we associate sounds and smells with pleasures and displeasure. So we very much function like that, like other beings do too. Now, as soon as we are born, for those of you who know some Freud or Beauvoir, you can just sort of put them in here too. It's a very similar type of account. So when we are born on this account, we have a reflexively self-conscious self that has three sort of conscious drives to it on this account. Namely, we strive to preserve ourselves. So we come out, and as soon as the senses are activated, then we strive to survive, that is to suck. We feel displeasure of being hungry. We have a sex drive, meaning that we are susceptive, right? Pleasure and displeasure in touch. And we have a search for basic community or affectionate love. So we hold newborn babies typically, for example, close. So we hold them. So this is the type of an account to explain, say, how both the babies are, but also how we are around newborn babies. Namely, we hold them, we touch them, we speak softly to them, so affectionately to them, and we try and help them start preserving themselves. This is reflexive self-consciousness. So it's a striving self that isn't yet reflective. With time, like I mentioned, predominantly it's combined with associative thought. So the sound of your parents or loved ones, the smells of milk, etc., you associate that with pleasure, and that's basically how it functions. Okay, so I started developing that, tracking time a bit now. So moving on a little bit quickly. It doesn't take very long with a newborn baby. I don't remember how long it is, but maybe it's about 3 months or something, when the baby starts to smile. And so this is a very Rousseauian-inspired element in Kant's account. So the baby starts to smile, and as you know, and if you have been parents, you know it first personally, it's a sort of a source of great joy. Namely, that the baby now takes pleasure in seeing you. And on this type of account, to be able to smile to the parents and taking joy in the parents smiling back, it involves being able to relate to an image of oneself, to be seen. Put it differently, it's on this account, sort of a Kantian Rousseauian element of the mirror test. So to be able to pass the mirror test, you have to be able to relate to an image of yourself. Chimps can do it, we can do it, elephants can do it, etc. But it's that element that being able to relate to an image of yourself is to have a social sense of self. And the social sense of self is deeply emotional, impactful for us. So as Rousseau says, and Kant says in the Doctrine of Right, it is the foundation of very, very strong emotions that are also related to things like we can kill for them, or we can be killed for them, like jealousy or envy, those types of social emotions. Kant is a bit different from Rousseau as I read him. unless you convince me otherwise, because Kant thinks that originally this is good. So originally the parents and the newborn, they smile to each other and they genuinely take joy in being seen by each other. It's not originally a comparative one, or one that ultimately does develop out of it, namely comparative emotions such as jealousy and envy. So the last part of then humanity is what Kant calls rational end setting, which is part of the root of freedom for us. So Kant emphasizes that when the newborn baby is born, only the human being screams. And he argues that that scream is an original brute expression of freedom. So it's an expression of freedom in that it is a frustration of not being able to act. So newborn babies, human beings, are characterized by how they can't do anything. So compared to most other animals who can do things when they're born, human beings can kind of do almost nothing. And so originally, we have brute freedom as a frustration. Now, if you look at the animality and humanity, animality here, Kant says, makes you into a living being, humanity into a rational being, and personality into a responsible being. And from now onwards, I can go very fast because this is the part of the story that you know super well. With time, we then develop not only reflexive self-consciousness, but we become capable of reflective self-consciousness and reflection in general. Long story short, but as the baby now starts to do something, is the sort of the small beginnings of acting of maxims. And with time, they learn to use abstract conceptual thoughts like milk, mommy, stuff like that. And with much more time, the toddler at some point is able to relate not just to themselves with a third person, like does Helga want milk, but do you want? So it's able to do the reflective self-consciousness. And so once it's capable of doing to think about themselves as I want something, and also starting to master abstract conceptual thought, like I want to do something and act on a maxim, I want to walk to mommy, right? So can hold the maxim in the mind and walk. So once that stuff starts to happen, you start to be able to do the things that ultimately becomes personality or moral responsibility. So that once you can feel, as you know, moral feeling is the ought. So once you can recognize I ought to do something, it shows that your cognitive capacity abilities now are at the level needed for moral responsibility. So on this account, you find in the religion, the human being then is threefold in that it has animality. All of it is conscious, by the way, but it has animality, makes it a living being. Humanity makes it into a rational being, a being who can set and pursue ends of their own, and also has a social sense of self. And finally, personality, constituted by moral feeling, namely being able to be motivated by your practical reason. So you can do something just because it's the right thing to do. Now, one last little part here. As I read Kant here, he thinks that when the baby originally navigates their pleasures and pains with regard to food, sustenance, safety, sensuous touch, and affectionate love, they navigate internally with regard to what he calls the natural vital force. So the baby is striving for harmony, but harmony is felt internally then with regard to whether or not their natural vitality is peaceful or harmonious. So newborn babies, parents around their newborn babies, they strive for the baby to be harmonious. And on this account, it means that the baby navigates pleasures and displeasures with regard to harmony, which is a strong natural vital force, right? So a happy first day of a baby's life is just a life where all the activities are either eating, pooping, touch, and affection, no weaning, right? And how does the baby do it? With navigating pleasures and displeasures and the natural vital force. Kant then thinks that what is enabled up here with personality and rational end setting or setting ends of your own is then navigated with regard to the moral vital force. So it is once you develop a strong moral character in this account, it's constitutive of your vitality that you can rely on doing the right things because it's the right thing to do. So you integrate these forces, or put it differently, the highest good for Kant is to pursue happiness within the constraints of morality, which is also then to realize your natural vital force within the constraints of your moral vital force, and to strive always to bring them into a harmonious union. 10 more minutes, I definitely will be able to do LGBTQIA, maybe a touch on race too, at least enough so you can ask questions. Notice too then, so we start like other animals to use a lot of associative thought, pleasures and displeasure, and associate sounds and smells, etc., with associative thought. As we learn to use conceptual thought or reasoning, then our way of being becomes much more complex, right? Put it differently again, it's not just that we eat, but as we learn to use concepts for various types of food, also we're starting to say, I would like, and I can start using concepts, not just milk, meaning everything liquid, but water, milk, lemonade, whatever. Also, as we develop aesthetic thought. So the sublime and the beautiful. Illustrating again quickly now. So not only can I say that I want milk, but I can also describe milk with aesthetic qualities, such as is deeply pleasing, I like the way it feels in my mouth, or whatever. But also your meals, say, you're starting to learn how to be the social activity of eating for human beings, such as you're starting to learn to sit at the table, or you're starting to learn to have meals, which have distinctive aesthetic qualities to them. It should be beautiful, right? It should be aesthetically pleasing, etc., etc. Should be harmonious in that way. Finally, going very fast, but still, the imagination, the capacity for us to synthesize, including in new ways, is constitutive for how we now start realizing our entire human selves well. I can have been to a great meal, say, and I see something very beautiful and it tastes amazingly. And I know all the spices, all the ingredients, and then I can imagine how to put it together slightly differently. And it gives a somewhat different experience, but it is still an aesthetically and in terms of taste, etc., quite an amazing experience. So I can reimagine how to do things. Okay, so once you have these moves, so going a bit quickly, I have 7 minutes left, so I'm going to move a bit fast here. Once you have this, you can see how Kant did say heterosexual lives or woman. It's not very hard. He puts a certain teleological spin on this, and it becomes that type of an account. So he thinks, for example, how do you explain heterosexuality? Well, because the species have to maintain itself, so we can assume a teleological in principle informing how they preserve themselves, how they have sex, and how they have affection, so that you get men and women complementing each other in such a way that you sustain the species. Also reflected in then men tending to go out and hunt and stuff. Women get pregnant, they're at home, they tend to the house, and they develop then different types of social virtues. And Kant also thinks then they can all be morally responsible, but the man then becomes responsible for representing out in the world and taking part in politics, the legal political sphere, whereas women become sort of in charge of all social aspects. That's how he did it. But what is the problem? Well, one of the problems where he did a mistake, in my view, is that he didn't do what his philosophy says you should do around these topics. Namely, once you move from abstract conceptual thought and personality or universalizing maxims and acting from the moral law, then you're moving from the non-contingent, or the element that has clear sort of clear presence of practical reason in it, so a priori, namely you should universalize maxims to make sure that they are more, what you're doing is morally responsible. But once you move down to animality and social sense of self, down here, you're moving from the non-contingent to the contingent. And as Kant says many times already in the opening of the groundwork, there's no one way to do this. So if you want to get wise about this, you have to listen to people's lives. So you have to look at how people live, and what he says other places like enlarged mind. You have to have an enlarged mind. You have to listen to the people whose lives you are critiquing with philosophy. And they have an important component for you to possibly become wise about what it is that you're talking about. So if you move to women or LGBTQIA and you listen to them, including their frustrations in the world or the isms, you will have much more with which to think, so that once you think, you have an ability to use philosophy or make philosophy available to people so that they can make sense of their lives. So, put it very simply, Kant didn't have to listen very much, and he certainly did listen to some of them, but he just ignored them. Women who were frustrated not to be able to participate in academic thinking or in legal political life, representation in that kind, and also, of course, LGBTQIA lives who were in despair because of the way in which being who they were was facing legal threats in the world. Now, I'm going to be very quick now because I do want to finish on time. I'll just do a few moves to open up the possibility of a conversation later. If you do this with the concern that modernity is has a problem of alienation, you can see this in Kantian thought. So in a lot of Kantian, what we inherit, there's a deep sense in which all that is deemed valuable is rational end-setting of maxims, a universalizing maxim, and acting, doing what is right because it's right. All of this has no value or is a problem or a danger and nothing to be understood with any great detail. If that is what we're continuing, I believe we have our own version of alienation in Kant theory. And the one way to overcome it philosophically is exactly to stop doing that. Finally, I don't think one way to think of it is to say that I think more radically even than Arendt, the problem isn't just that. If you were to do this with Arendt, by the way, it would be labor, work, and action and rationality. So it's not a perfect match, but it's similar. So I'm more radical than Arendt. It's not just that we lost the ability to discern the different activities and speak with philosophical theory to help us understand our lives. That is a problem. But I think in modernity, we went to war against it. So it wasn't just that we devalued animality and social aspects of life or earthly life in general, but we went to war against it. And so I don't think it's an accident that LGBTQIA lives, for example, or women who enjoyed sexuality, as Foucault talks a lot about, not just were excluded anymore in modernity, but increasingly we started to use state institutions to target those lives and destroy them. And similarly, that indigenous peoples, for example, who were very in tune with earthly life and had religious activities around it, were also sort of extraordinarily brutally attacked. Also, I don't think it's an accident that Kant and a lot of racist thought in modernity switched from a beginning of thinking, well, you know, here we are living in different places on the planet, and that seems to have an effect on various ways we act, and you can racialize in that way, to becoming a racism that was attached to skin color. I think one reason it was attacked to skin color, I don't have time to talk about the propensity to evil, but you can do it with that too, is that if you attack it to skin color, just like LGBTQIA lives, the thing is, on the one hand, a skin color or LGBTQIA identity is deeply tied into how we are or realize our animality. And if you attach it to skin color or to LGBTQIA identity, you make it the case that the kind of violence you're going to be subjected to will attack your body. So you can't be safe at all, not even in yourself. And you can also not get rid of it. We can't get rid of our skin, just like we can't get rid of our LGBTQIA identity. It's fundamental to how we are in the world and feel ourselves as safe, and also as sensuous beings who are touched, right? Affectionately loved by being held close. And with time also, as we then develop ourselves as feeling ourselves as beautiful. Once you go to this switch, I think we had in modernity, where you attack animality like it did, like as if it is something to be destroyed altogether, and as if that's a better life, then it's no accident that also Kant started to attack racialization to skin color. Because it is one of, let me put that at the end because I'm out of time, it is a way in which to do violence to other human beings that not only treats them with no dignity, as not having a right to freedom, as should be shamed of themselves, but you go all the way down to your reflexive sense of self or your fundamental sense of being safe at all in your own body. And so there was no accident. It was like that in Kant. And that's also part of what we need to overcome today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Helga, for the very clear presentation, and also at the beginning for giving such a clear introduction to your own work and to its context. We'll now open it up to the Q&A. Please keep your questions or responses brief. Please understand that given the very limited amount of time, there's really not enough time for follow-up questions and that sort of thing. Also, if you'd like to send me a message in the chat, I'd be happy to read it. So I see Ephraim.
So, hi, everybody, and thanks for putting this together. Thanks, Helga, and congrats for everything. So I'll try to be brief. Would you agree that the expression "realize our animality" involves some kind of reflective process? I would, this is my questions. We're not allowed to engage in question and answer, but well, that's a topic I'd like to pose. No, if it's a reflective process, then it's tied up with moral feeling, and it's tied up with the art and the synthetic unity of a perception. Would you agree with this? Because if you do, then I think this is like sort of the interface between a theory of human nature on the one hand, and the theory of what's valid for rational beings, so-called ideal theory. Would you agree that this is an interface? Thank you.
Thank you for the question. It's excellent, of course. I think it involves all kinds of thought, all the kinds of thoughts. All right, so reflexive and reflective, not just one, and also aesthetic. So I think developing our animality is a very complex process. It involves developing concepts, of course, like and also how to feel oneself, and we use concepts for that, but we don't use only concepts, right? So aesthetic thought and feelings are not conceptual. We can use them to try and strive for a concept, but there's a deep sense in which it involves feeling, right? So for me, when we develop our animality, and hence it's much more complex than the other animals, at least more complex, though I think some of them are more complex than we currently think. But so we have associative thought, reflective thought, teleological thought, aesthetic thought, you know, all of it is involved when we develop our animality. But there is also a very deep foundational striving for it in terms of self-preservation, sex drive, and affectionate community that is there and present in us and important in us much before we are capable of reflective thought, let alone reflective self-conscious thought and moral responsibility. One last little one. One reason why we also have a lot of pathologies is because we start our development of all of that in cultures and families that have all of it in various ways, and before we are able to be morally responsible. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Martina.
Yeah, thank you, Helga. This was very interesting. So I was wondering about the point that you made about the importance of gaining an enlarged mind. So listening to others' viewpoints and gaining an understanding of what it is like for them to live in the way they do. And I was wondering how could that be squared with the teleological thinking to which Kant seems so committed when he talks about, for instance, race and gender. So how are we hitting a wall with that? And I guess that a way out is to say that this teleological thinking is has a lot of limitations within Kant theory. So now, what do you think about that?
Thank you. And I, like with the other question, I hope we continue to talk about it, right? So I'll just give you some indications of how I'm thinking. I think when we want to rethink Kant's enlarged mind, so sometimes I think it's very easy to just join him, because sometimes I think a lot of it is very good. But then he has tons of prejudices, like we all do. It's not just Kant who has it, we have it too. So study Kant is to study ourselves too. But we can rethink what it means to have an enlarged mind by not only using it sort of that I think about them in a certain sense, but it, to me, profoundly involves learning to listen. And to me, part of learning to listen, including as a Kant scholar, or making philosophical resources available so that we can listen, right, involves thinking through the stuff about human nature or different kinds of thought, right? And teleological thinking, for me, two elements to it. Yeah, we have to think differently about how we view others as complementing us, right? Kant was wrong about that. But also on his own theory, kind of, you know, it's not strict universality once you go down to biological matters, let alone when you put in complicated human beings like human beings. So part of it is like thinking more clearly about that, what you can say when you're using teleological thought, and let alone for human beings. But then in general, teleological thought, I think, is quite useful when we go and listen, just in that it's parts and wholes. Like, how is this human being striving to have a whole in their lives? How are they trying to get all of this together and consistent with who they are? So teleological thinking, I think, is part of that, but it's not the whole part. There's also going to be aesthetic thinking. It's going to be abstract conceptual thought. It's going to be various types of imagination. You know, it's all there. So it just gives us more with which to listen. And generally, which would also hold for Hannah Arendt, by the way, actually listening, right? Rather than sort of moralize them or tell them what they ought to feel, right? But actually having a real process of dialogue where you learn. Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
Okay, thank you. And our last question for this session, this talk, not session, can be asked by Daniel.
Hi, Helga. That was really helpful and really interesting. I just wanted to ask about one very small specific point, just because I've been thinking about Kant's aesthetics recently. You talked about the development aesthetic thought, and I hadn't really thought about the development side of it. And you said that quite young, a child has this develops quite young. But and you associated it with pleasurable sensations of drinking milk and so on and so forth. And I just wanted to understand better how we end up with a disinterested liking devoid of all interest, and one that is not based on a liking for the agreeable, which Kant needs to separate out in order for it to count as aesthetic thought, and what kind of self-awareness would be required in order for it to count as aesthetic in separating it from the agreeable. Just a
Yeah, super good. And I'm not done with trying to figure all of this out, right? So I'll just say where I am right now, and then again, I hope we just continue. So I do think that children start with the agreeable, right? So it doesn't take long before they have favorite blankets, favorite types of colors, the things they want to be next to them, like touches and things, to sleep or feel safe, etc., etc. I think that's the agreeable developing. But I think that just like moral consciousness and moral being, so requires reflective thought at quite a high level. So I think that the being able to appreciate beauty, so disinterested, also will come quite late. For a long time, it's the agreeable, right? And even like with hiking, if you've gone hiking as kids for a long time, it's the agreeables prominent, you know, it's the chocolate you get when you get on the top, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think it's a sort of a slow process of learning to appreciate, say, the stunning views on the top of the mountain. If you try and drag a child up to the top of the mountain to appreciate the stunningness of it too early, they're going to hate hiking, right? So I think that, but that's, so doing it well just means that you're tracking the ways in which to really appreciate, to really be able to do disinterested, you do need quite a lot of reflective and self-reflective abilities that you don't have for a long time, just like you don't with moral responsibility. I don't know if they come exactly at the same time. I don't know. But in a certain sense, if this theory is not crazy, that's part of what we can maybe pay attention to when we see children developing. Do these things, or is it the case that just because you don't need a concept when you do aesthetic beauty, that could be earlier than what you're able to do with moral responsibility, which does require abstract universal thought and so universalizing? I'm not entirely sure, but that would roughly be how I think about it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much for that first presentation and for the questions. Our next presentation will be by John Walsh. He is Assistant Professor of Philosophy at Martin Luther University in Halle-Wittenberg. He earned his PhD in 2018 at the University of South Florida in Tampa, Florida, and has been a visiting research fellow at Brown University and at the Université de Fribourg. His research focuses on the intersection of metaphysics and ethics in classical German philosophy. He has co-edited volumes with Cambridge and Oxford and published several book chapters as well as articles in British Journal for the History of Philosophy, Kantian Review. He was awarded the 2022 Fichte Prize. And of course, more recently, he's won the Sellers Prize. So we're very happy to have you here today, and we look forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much for the introduction, and thanks to the organizers of the Virtual Congress and the North American Kant Society for the opportunity to speak here. My presentation is based on the Wilfrid Sellers Prize paper, and that's recently been published in Kantian Review, and I just sent a link in the chat. Although the paper is published, your comments will be very helpful to me on related projects, so I'll be grateful for your feedback and look forward to the discussion. So is the PowerPoint in order? Great, thank you. A core feature of Kant's critical account of moral motivation is that pure reason can be practical by itself. On this view, pure reason legislates the moral law, which is itself the genuine moral incentive of pure practical reason. In recent decades, Kant's account of moral motivation has received considerable attention. To explicate his critical view on the topic, scholars often appeal to Kant's distinction between the principium judicationis and principium executionis, or principle of adjudication and principle of execution. This distinction, stemming from Kant's 1770s lectures on ethics, indicates the normative and performative moments of moral motivation. The principle of adjudication is the supreme standard of moral appraisal. The principle of execution, identified with moral feeling, the incentive that moves the agent to act according to the norm. Thus, these principles track the cognitive and conative aspects of moral agency. They are important to the development of Kant's views on moral motivation because he combines them in his critical account. The moral law is the supreme moral norm, and via respect is the sole and also undoubted moral incentive. The standard reading of Kant's 1770s lectures denies the intimate connection between moral incentive and norm characteristic of the critical account of moral motivation. On this view, the moral incentive is not grounded in cognition of the norm. In this article, I offer an alternative to the standard reading. I argue that in Kant's 1770s view, pure reason is practical. So, the hallmark of Kant's critical account of motivation was already contained in his pre-critical view. To develop this interpretation, I begin in section 2 with Kant's principles of adjudication and execution, and argue that the moral incentive is affected by moral judgment. To succeed, this interpretation must overcome two puzzles. In section 3, I address Kant's apparent claims that moral judgment does not affect the moral incentive, their relationship being one of mere external conformity. Such claims, I argue, concern Kant's view that cognition of the moral law is necessary but not sufficient for acting morally. Then, in section 4, I turn to the second puzzle, Kant's supposed quasi-eudaimonism. Although Kant correlates the existence of God and reward with the execution of obligation, he nevertheless takes moral worth to consist in acting for the sake of the moral law. The existence of God is a postulate of pure practical reason. I conclude in section 5 by discussing the payoffs of my interpretation. It resolves a long-standing controversy concerning Kant's apparent eudaimonism in the Critique of Pure Reason, and shows that Kant developed his account of autonomy in the 1770s. In the 1770s lectures on ethics, Kant claims that the principle of morality, quote, must be a single principle emanating from the ground of our will. Moreover, quote, every moral law expresses a categorical necessity. Hence, the moral imperative commands categorically and absolutely. Since all necessary rules must be certain a priori, and hence the principles are intellectual, the principle of morality, quote, has its ground in the understanding and can be cognized completely a priori. Thus, the moral principle is a purely intellectual principle of pure reason. Significantly, Kant explicates the supreme principle of morality in connection with the principle of adjudication and principle of execution. And this quote is significant because it's the first passage in the section called On the Supreme Principle of Morality. So Kant takes this distinction in this passage to be very central to the elucidation of the supreme principle of morality. We have first to take up 2 points here, the principle of adjudication of obligation and the principle of execution or performance of obligation. Guideline and incentive are to be distinguished. The guideline is the principle of adjudication, and the incentive that of carrying out the obligation. The principle of adjudication is the norm and concerns what is morally good or not. It is the objective standard of moral goodness and depravity. The principle of execution indicates the incentive that moves me or incites me to act according to the moral norm. This incentive, quote, lies in the heart and is moral feeling. Note Kant's claim that confusion of these principles has set moral inquiry on the wrong track. Quote, insofar as they have been confused, everything in morality has been erroneous. Thus, the relationship between the moral norm and incentive, in a word, moral motivation, is crucial to Kant's exposition of the supreme moral principle. In what follows, I argue that cognition of the moral norm affects the moral incentive. In order to do so, I first draw attention to a feature of Kant's mature moral philosophy found in the 1770s lectures on ethics. Moral worth consists in acting for the sake of the moral law. Kant correlates an action's moral worth with its conformity to universality. Quote, the morality of action consists in the universal form, which is purely intellectual, of the understanding. However, mere external conformity to the universal rule is not sufficient for moral worth. Quote, for morality, a good will is required. Thus, quote, our free conduct rests solely on the good will if it is to possess moral goodness. In this case, quote, our actions must occur from a motive of the universal rule. So, Kant claims that, quote, to hold a promise out of satisfaction of sensibility is not moral. Instead, I must make conformity to the universal rule the basis of my actions, for only then do they, quote, arise from the moral principle. In order for an action to arise from the moral principle, it must take place, quote, because it conforms to the universal rule. As in the groundwork, morally good actions must be performed, quote, for the sake of the law. Acting for the sake of a maxim's universal form involves having a moral disposition. Quote, if I do something because it is absolutely good in itself, then that is a moral disposition. Thus, quote, all morality is based on the action being performed for the sake of the inner constitution of the action itself. Hence, it is not the action that makes for morality, but the disposition from which I do it. This tracks Kant's distinction between acting merely in conformity with duty and acting from duty. Quote, the conformity of the action to the laws out of dispositions and from duty possesses morality. Kant identifies the heart with the moral disposition, saying, quote, heart is the principle of the moral disposition. Recall that Kant locates the moral incentive in the heart. So, moral worth, understood in terms of acting from a moral disposition whereby the moral law is made the basis of one's action, is connected intimately with the moral incentive, the principle of execution. What then is the relationship between objective motives, grounds of what we should do, and incentives, or subjective motives, grounds of disposition, and the determination of the will to satisfy the rule? As in his critical view, Kant maintains that the human will does not necessarily conform to objective principles. Quote, the appraisal of the action is the objective ground, but not yet the subjective ground. Cognition of the objective norm is not sufficient for volition. Yet, if this judgment moves me to do the action, that is the moral feeling, that is the incentive of the action. By the early to mid 1770s, Kant came to the position, as expressed in the Critique of Practical Reason, that in actions of moral worth, quote, the objective determining ground must always and quite alone be also the subjective determining ground. Specifically, cognition of the moral law affects the moral incentive. Thus, in a famous letter to Marcus Hertz from late 1773, Kant writes that the supreme ground of morality, quote, must have the power to move, and therefore, although it is intellectual, it must nevertheless have a direct relation to the primary incentives of the will. Likewise, in a reflection from the early 1770s, Kant asserts, quote, the understanding must excite sensibility, and as a result, it determines the action. Thus, the action occurs according to laws of sensibility, yet of the understanding as well. Corroborating Kant's claim in the lectures on ethics that the moral incentive, in the guise of moral feeling, consists in being moved by moral judgment, he notes in a reflection from 1772 that, quote, the moral feeling follows from the moral concept, and in another from the same year that, quote, the moral feeling arises from moral judgment. So far, I've argued that in Kant's 1770s view, consciousness of the moral law in moral judgment affects the moral incentive. Thus, the connection between the principle of adjudication and principle of execution bears on moral worth in a way that anticipates Kant's mature account of moral motivation. However, several passages in the 1770s lectures on ethics militate against this reading, suggesting that the connection between moral incentive and norm is only coincidental. In what follows, I argue that these claims express Kant's view that the subjective grounds of human volition do not necessarily conform to objective principles. Moral motivation further requires the cultivation of our capacity to be affected by moral judgment. Preliminary to the discussion, consider the following passage from the 1770s lectures on metaphysics, where Kant appears to deny any motive force of objective principles on human beings. He says, quote, "It is a misfortune for the human race that moral laws, which are here objectively necessitating, are not simultaneously also subjectively necessitating." However, a close reading of this controversial passage reveals that Kant is not rejecting the motive force of objective principles per se, but only denying that cognition of them is sufficient for volition. Objective principles are not simultaneously subjectively necessitating. Moreover, in the same paragraph, Kant asserts an objective necessitation can also be subjective, namely, if the mere cognition of the action that it is good moves my subject to perform it, then it is an incentive. If the cognition of the understanding has the power to move the subject to the action merely because the action in itself is good, then this motive power is an incentive, which we also call moral feeling. Note the correspondence with Kant's claims in the Kähler notes discussed in the previous section, that the moral incentive consists in being moved by cognition of the objective moral norm. Consequently, the controversial passage reflects Kant's view that the human will is, quote, morally imperfect, and therefore not infallibly determined by objective principles. So we can deal rather quickly with this passage from the Lectures on Metaphysics. Alternatively, some passages in the Kähler manuscript, the Lectures on Ethics, do suggest that moral agency consists in bringing our natural feelings into external conformity with the moral law. For example, Kant apparently claims that human beings cannot be moved by objective grounds, but can merely habituate themselves to act in accordance with them. He says, quote, "The human being has no such secret organization that he can be moved by objective grounds. Yet we can indeed produce a habitus, which is not natural, but replaces nature, and becomes habitual through imitation and frequent exercise." Moreover, Kant appears to equate the moral incentive with coincidence with objective grounds. Quote, "A sensibility that accords with the motive force of the understanding would be moral feeling. This coincidence, wrought by habit, seems to rest on developing an aversion to actions contradictory to the moral law. Quote, everyone can see that the action is abhorrent, but whoever feels this abhorrence has a moral feeling. If sensibility abhors what the understanding recognizes as abhorrent, this is moral feeling." As a result, several scholars take Kant's 1770s view on moral motivation to consist in merely aligning our natural feelings with the objective moral norm. Other commentators, recognizing Kant's entertainment of his mature account of moral motivation, contend that he balked at fully committing to this view. Yet, this reading Kant this way contradicts his claims, discussed in section 2, about moral worth and moral motivation. The conformity to the moral principle required for moral worth involves acting for the sake of the moral law, that is, from duty, whereby conformity to universality is made the basis of volition. As shown, this entails acting from a disposition whose principle is the moral incentive affected by cognition of the moral law. By my lights, this puzzle can be solved by heeding two senses of the term moral feeling, incentive and capacity. As we've seen, Kant identifies the principle of execution with moral feeling as incentive. Significantly, he also conceives of moral feeling as a, quote, capacity to be affected by moral judgment. And this dual function of moral feeling remains in Kant's mature writings. But I will skip over the passages in his mature writings. I submit that Kant's claims about habit be understood as highlighting the role of moral education in cultivating moral feeling qua capacity. Thus, moral feeling is cultivated through long practice, in which moral motives are strengthened, and which Kant tasks education and religion. Several aspects of this cultivation described in the Kähler manuscript parallel Kant's other writings on moral education. For instance, Kant observes that actions contrary to the moral law must be represented as intrinsically abhorrent. For example, the child who lies must not be punished but shamed. Likewise, in the Lectures on Pedagogy, Kant claims that everything is spoiled if one seeks to ground moral cultivation upon examples, threats, and punishments, since one must see to it that the pupil not only does the good, but does it because it is good. Hence, if a child lies, for example, it must not be punished, but rather met with condemnation. Moreover, Kant correlates moral cultivation with disgust and abhorrence toward immorality. A disgust and abhorrence, a condemnation toward it must be developed, as if the child were pelted with excrement. Through such frequent repetition, we can arouse in him such an abhorrence to the action, which can become habitual. In a word, Kant's 1770s remarks on developing abhorrence to immorality through habit are not an explanation of the moral incentive, but of the cultivation of our capacity to be affected by moral judgment. This cultivation is a necessary condition for cognition of the moral law to affect moral feeling qua incentive. Thus, Kant claims that, quote, moral feeling must first be made active so that the subject can be moved by moral motives. As a result of the cultivation of moral feeling, quote, morality will have the force of incentive. This view persists in Kant's mature writings. Hence, Kant's remarks on moral education and the doctrine of method of the second critique concern the way in which one can make objectively practical reason subjectively practical as well. Notably, in the Metaphysics of Morals, Kant counts moral feeling among, quote, the natural predispositions of the mind for being affected by concepts of duty, and asserts our obligation, quote, to cultivate and to strengthen it, without which the moral vital force could no longer excite this feeling. So, Kant argues in the Kähler manuscript for the empirical cultivation of our natural capacity to be affected by moral judgment as a necessary condition to excite the moral incentive. The second hurdle faced by my interpretation concerns Kant's apparent claims that divine reward is the moral incentive. The aim of this section is to show that even in the 1770s, Kant instead takes the existence of God to be a condition of the highest good. So, moral motivation consists in acting for the sake of the moral law, consciousness of which postulates God's existence. To be sure, an extended passage in the Kähler manuscript suggests a eudaimonistic account of moral motivation. In performance, there must indeed be a being who constrains us to do what is morally good. However, we need no third being to appraise morality. All moral laws can be correct without such a being. Yet, in execution, they would be empty if no third being were able to constrain us to them. Thus, it has rightly been recognized that without a supreme judge, all moral laws would be without effect, for in that case, there would be no incentive, no reward, and no punishment. Hence, cognition of God is necessary with respect to the execution of moral laws. Although the objective moral norm is independent of God, the moral incentive appears to consist in divine reward and punishment. Moreover, this seems to endow moral laws with their obligatory force. God thus appears to be the obligator of moral laws. And there are various scholars in the secondary literature who hold a eudaimonistic or theologically imbued eudaimonistic reading of Kant's account of moral motivation in the lectures, but I'll pass over those for now. Yet several contravening claims in the 1770s lectures on ethics reject such a theologically imbued eudaimonism. Thus, Kant denies the moral worth of action performed on the basis of anticipated divine punishment or reward. He says, quote, if we are to execute the moral law out of fear of punishment and the might of God, then we do not do it out of duty and obligation. Likewise, quote, if I act in accordance with the divine will and perform good deeds in order to receive reward from God hereafter, then I did not perform the action from a moral disposition. So, quote, I must not lie, not because it is forbidden by God, but because it is good in itself. Hence, an action must be done not because God wills it, but because it is upright and good in itself. Note, too, Kant's rejection of moral obligations' dependence on an external will, and therefore God. Quote, it may indeed seem that in an obligation we are necessitated per arbitrium alterius. However, I am necessitated by an arbitrium internum, not externum, and thus by the necessary condition of universal will. Hence, we are obligated by our own will, not that of another, including God. Indeed, the internal character of moral obligation and moral motivation is part and parcel of Kant's account of moral worth. Quote, if I satisfy my obligation through my own will, then the motive is internal, and I do the action from duty. Even in this early context, the relevant claims about the existence of God pertain not to moral motivation, but to the highest good. In the 1770s lectures on ethics, Kant treats the highest good in connection with the ancients. Yet this treatment is rife with Kant's own burgeoning views on the topic. In particular, the highest good consists in happiness in proportion to worthiness to be happy. As in his mature view, the concepts of morality and worthiness to be happy are analytically connected. Kant elucidates this connection apropos reward and punishment, distinguishing between rewards of inducement and those of requital, whereas the former are allotted when, quote, the action is done solely for the sake of the promised reward. Rewards of requital are distributed when, quote, the action is done solely from a good disposition, from pure morality. Actions done merely out of a good disposition and pure morality are eligible for the praemorium remunerantium. For here the action accords with morality, and that is the greatest worthiness of happiness. Hence, quote, the morally disposed person is eligible for an infinite reward and happiness, and can expect the reward from the Supreme Being. These, quote, premia moralia follow from consciousness of the moral law and the morally upright. Quote, the natural moral law already carries such promises with it in a subject that has a morally good disposition. The prospect of happiness, in proportion to worthiness of it, entailed by consciousness of the moral law, implicates the idea of God. Recall Kant's claim, suggestive of eudaimonism, that, quote, without a supreme judge, all moral laws would be without effect, for in that case there would be no incentive, no reward, and no punishment, from which he concludes that, quote, cognizance of God is necessary with respect to the execution of moral laws. I take in this passage, which is at first blush problematic, his reference to supreme judge to be very important. The efficacy of moral laws turns on God's role as supreme judge. Kant's remarks on the role of judge elsewhere in the lectures are instructive. He says, quote, he who is warranted to adjudicate with legal effect and also has authority to carry it out is a judge. God, as supreme judge, is authorized to bestow happiness upon those who are worthy of it. As explained in the second critique, this presupposes God's moral perfection and omnipotence. Only from a will that is morally perfect, holy, and beneficent, and at the same time also all-powerful, can we hope to attain the highest good. In the 1770s lectures on ethics, the representation of God's moral perfection is a consequence of consciousness of the moral law. Quote, hence we recognize the divine will through reason. We represent God as having the most holy and most perfect will. Thus we recognize the perfection of the divine will from the moral law. God's moral perfection qualifies him as lawgiver, who, quote, declares that the necessary practical laws accord with his will. Note, however, that God is not the author of the moral law, since it is necessary in itself. Nevertheless, quote, moral laws can still be subject to a lawgiver. That is, there may be a being who has all power and authority to execute these laws and declare that this moral law is simultaneously a law of his will and obligate everyone to act accordingly. As morally perfect, God's will is ipso facto in conformity with the moral law. This, coupled with his moral perfection and omnipotence, qualifies God to declare moral laws to be also laws of his will. By conceiving of moral laws as divine commands, we satisfy the condition presupposed by the highest good that our moral volition harmonize with the will of a supreme being alone capable of connecting happiness with moral worth. Quote, thus, God must necessarily reward human beings whose conduct conforms to moral laws. For in this case, human conduct harmonizes with the moral laws, and therefore with the divine will as well. Even if all this is correct, what are we to make of Kant's suggestion that without God, quote, all moral laws would be without effect, for in that case there would be no incentive? Kant's point, I take it, is that the denial of a condition of the highest good would undermine moral efficacy. Since the highest good is a corollary of the moral law, to abrogate the possibility of the highest good would commit us to a contradiction in our practical rationality. Consequently, the moral law would lose its incentive force. And on the PowerPoint, there's a few passages about postulates from reflections in the 1770s, but I will pass over that for the sake of time. But also in Kant's later works, he seems to imply his sustained commitment to this view. Thus, in What Does It Mean to Orient Oneself in Thinking, Kant argues that reason must assume a supreme intelligence for the sake of the highest good. Quote, not, of course, to derive from this assumption the binding authority of moral precepts or the incentives to observe them, for they would have no moral worth if their motive were derived from anything but the law alone, which is apodictically certain. Instead, this assumption serves, quote, to give objective reality to the concept of the highest good, that is, to prevent it, along with morality, from being taken as a mere ideal, as it would be if that whose idea inseparably accompanies morality should not exist anywhere. Similarly, in the Critique of Practical Reason, he claims, since the promotion of the highest good is an a priori necessary object of our will and inseparably bound up with the moral law, the impossibility of the first must also prove the falsity of the second. Consequently, if the highest good is impossible in accordance with practical rules, then the moral law which commands us to promote it must be fantastic and directed to empty imaginary ends, and must therefore in itself be false. Likewise, in the Critique of the Power of Judgment, Kant asserts that if the highest good were impossible, then reason, quote, would regard the moral law itself as a mere deception. So, Kant's 1770s position on the relation between moral efficacy and the highest good reflects his considered view on the topic throughout his mature corpus. By way of conclusion, I indicate two payoffs of my interpretation. First, it provides a key for understanding Kant's apparently quasi-eudaimonistic claims in the Critique of Pure Reason. Second, it shows that Kant developed the core features of his account of autonomy nearly a decade earlier than generally thought. In the first critique, Kant assumes, quote, pure moral laws which determine completely a priori the use of the freedom of a rational being, and which command absolutely. However, he supposedly endorses a quasi-eudaimonistic conception of moral motivation by citing worthiness to be happy as the motive of the moral law. Moreover, God is said to endow the moral law with obligatory force by virtue of this prospect. Without a supreme being, obligation would be without any incentives. Hence, moral laws, quote, presuppose the existence of a supreme being for their obligatory force. With the results of section 4 in view, however, it becomes clear that Kant neither considers the hope for happiness in proportion to worthiness of it to be the moral incentive, nor appeals to God as the source of the obligatory force of the moral law. Instead, worthiness to be happy partly constitutes the highest good, the prospect of which is not an incentive, but a necessary idea connected with morality. The moral disposition, as a condition, first makes partaking in happiness possible, rather than the prospect of happiness first making possible the moral condition. As in the 1770s lectures on ethics, we are internally obligated by laws with inner practical necessity. Likewise featured in the 1770s, the connection between God and the obligatory force of moral laws is a consequence of the highest good. Thus, reason must assume the conditions of the highest good, quote, or else regard moral laws as empty figments of the brain, since without that presupposition, their necessary consequence, which the same reason connects with them, would have to disappear. So, moral laws do not first become obligatory through the idea of God. Rather, we must postulate the existence of God so as not to undermine their intrinsic obligatory force. Despite the fact that the term autonomy never appears in the 1770s lectures on ethics, I submit that Kant's account of autonomy was already in place at this time. Autonomy is, quote, the property of the will by which it is a law unto itself. For Kant, the sole law fit to hold this office is a universal, intrinsically binding one whose seat is in pure reason. Kant is generally taken to have developed his conception of autonomy around 1784, coterminous with the Feierabend lectures on natural right. Moreover, scholars argue that autonomy includes a motivational element, which was supposedly lacking until Kant's development of respect for the moral law around the same time. As I have argued, the intrinsically motivating character of the moral law was already in place in the mid-1770s. Coupled with the moral law's universal form, its internal obligatory force, and its source in pure reason, Kant's 1770s view on moral motivation demonstrates his commitment to the will's property of being a law unto itself. Thank you.
Thank you so much, John. We have a few minutes for a few questions. Okay, and if you have your hand up, I'll try to take notes. Okay, Eleanor.
Yeah, thank you very much for your presentation. And I find it really interesting is in particular the section about moral feeling, which reminds me about my own research on Jacobi. So in the very last section of the 1785 letters on Spinoza, Jacobi suggests that we human beings have an original feeling of what is right and what is wrong, according to which we make our moral judgments. So it seems to me that Kant's theory on how our moral motivation or incentive arises goes the other way around. So we have the moral judgment, we have the moral law first, we have the moral judgments first, and then we have the incentive to carry out what is right. So I wonder how Kant would react to Jacobi's theory that we first have the moral feeling according to which we make our moral judgments and decide on what to do.
Yes, thank you very much for that. That's a great question, and I think that that is an issue that Kant had grappled with for several decades. Even in the early 1760s, in the Preisschrift, he gestures toward Hutcheson and the British moral sense theorist, and he seemed to have been intrigued by this notion that moral feeling could be a source of moral judgment, as it were. But at least by the 1770s, if not earlier, I think some scholars argue that Kant never actually took the view too seriously. But with certainty, by the 1770s, he rejects that view. And actually, in these 1770s lectures on ethics, he explicitly addresses Hutcheson, and he says that moral feeling cannot be like the source of moral judgment because it wouldn't be universal or necessary. As a feeling, it would only be contingent. And there would be no way to resolve, a consequence of this would be that there would be no way to resolve moral disagreement. Perhaps you have a feeling when confronted with a certain morally distasteful situation, and I don't. And at the end of the day, nothing really much more could be said about it. And so Kant saw the need to have a rational basis for morality in order to account for its universal and necessary character.
Okay, thank you. At one point, I think I saw Ricardo's hand. So then we'll move on to Andrew.
Okay, great. Thanks, John, for the paper. And apologies that it looks like the VKC website has your title misspelled. That's what you get for writing your title in Latin. I just wanted to ask about this difference between sort of moral obligation or incentive and moral feeling, and maybe ask in the mode of the religion's way of thinking about these kinds of things. So, I mean, Helga was talking about the religion. The first degree of evil, or the first stage of radical evil, is this weird state where you still recognize the demands of the law, but you somehow feel subjectively unable to live up to them. And he even says, it's in the words of the apostle, I cannot do what I want, what I know I ought to do, or something along those lines. So I was wondering if there's a way to distinguish there between moral incentive, so rational incentive still being the moral law, thinking like I ought to do that, that is sufficient for me from a rational point of view. But then there is this other thing, sometimes he'll use the word Entschließung, resolve, to sort of describe this feeling that I somehow can't live up to it, or subjectively it's not sufficient for me. So there the distinction would be between incentive, so you're already recognizing that this has a pull on you, and maybe your rational nature is compelled, but there's something else, resolve, that isn't quite there yet. How does that fit into your picture regarding the way things develop in the 1770s. I mean, it's one other thing to say is this, so he has these very negative, hilarious things to say, which I hadn't seen before about, you shouldn't punish them, but rather shame them, or you shouldn't punish them, but rather throw excrement at them. But I wonder if the highest good doctrine is the sort of positive counterpart to that. So it's not that the highest good is supposed to be our incentive, but meditating on it or hoping for it can sort of fix our resolve problem. It's the opposite of shaming somebody. It's giving them this other sort of hope that can help stabilize their resolve.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. So as for the first part, with respect to recognizing the moral law as sufficient for my action and that being the incentive, as I read Kant in the 1770s, as well as the critique of practical reason, I take the incentive to have perhaps a stronger relation to feeling, so that in recognizing my duty or in cognition of the moral law, then what he would say in the second critique, then it produces or generates this feeling of respect, and so that there is an actual feeling that is felt. And so I think that would be important to recognize in this picture, and in the case of the person who recognizes the validity of the moral law but isn't subjectively moved by it, I guess I think that would have to fit in the picture, I guess. Like, does this person feel the feeling? That would be an important question. And if not, then perhaps Kant might say that this moral feeling as capacity, because I tried to distinguish between moral feeling as capacity and incentive, perhaps the capacity isn't sufficiently developed in order for the moral feeling or the moral incentive, the moral feeling qua incentive to actually be excited. And yes, perhaps our contemplation on the highest good can help get us there. And there are passages also in the 1770s lectures where Kant gestures in this direction, and even says in a few places that eudaimonistic motivation, although it is not sufficient for moral worth, isn't in itself bad, in the sense that perhaps people can fake it till they make it, and that just by using this as kind of a substitute motivation, it might help get people on the right track and develop their moral capacities in the way that they need to be.
Right. Yeah. No, I really think that's nice. The idea that contemplating or even developing hope for the highest good could be a way of developing what you're calling the capacity for feeling. Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And our final question for this paper can be asked by Laura.
Hi, well, I have a very basic question. I have very little knowledge of Kant's practical philosophy, so I'm sorry about that. But if I understood you correctly, your main thesis is that the consciousness of the moral law affects the moral incentive. So my question, if you could further develop the idea of consciousness of moral law, and more precisely the relationship of form and matter in this concept, because I was wondering whether this thesis wouldn't require certain kind of access to the content of the moral law so that it can work as to effect and work and operate on incentives. If it wouldn't require certain access to the, not only to the form, but also to the matter and the context of moral law itself. So like my question by the end would be, how do you understand consciousness of the moral law within your hypothesis?
Yeah, thank you very much for that. So I think Kant's views here in the 1770s, although I think kind of the core of his position of moral motivation is in place, I think the details get fleshed out in subsequent works. But he does talk about the universal form of actions and that their goodness consisting in this. So I would take the form matter distinction to be similar, if not at bottom the same, as that in the second critique. And there I understand Kant to hold that all maxims have a matter, and that this matter is essentially empirical and based on desire. And when we act in a way that is morally good, we don't act on the maxim because of this matter, but rather by virtue of its conformity to universal law-giving. And so I think, and that would be the form. And so I think the similar position is also in place here. And so to come to the question of consciousness of the moral law, I really like this passage in the Second Critique where Kant says that as soon as we draw up maxims for ourselves, we become conscious of the moral law. So I think the idea would be that in contemplating a maxim for a particular action that conforms to universal law-giving, then by virtue of this formal aspect of it, we then become conscious that it is the right thing to do. And I guess I'm not fully prepared to commit to a kind of phenomenological account of what that exactly looks like. But I think given his account of moral feeling as the incentive, I think that a feeling, a deep-seated feeling that this is the right thing to do would be associated with this kind of consciousness. And yeah, so I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for the question.
No, thank you.
Thank you very much for the presentation and for the questions. So our third and final speaker is Martina Favoretto. She is a postdoctoral fellow at the Center for Ethics of the University of Toronto. She received her PhD in philosophy from Indiana University, Bloomington. Her dissertation focused on what it is to act rationally in the context of Kant's ethics and how emotions can contribute positively or negatively to rational agency. Martina's current research explores the extent to which Kant's theory can be useful for guiding the way in which we should think about contemporary ethical issues. Before getting her PhD from Indiana University, Martina received her BA and her master's from the University of Pavia in Italy. And of course, she's the winner of the Marcus Hertz Prize. So we're very glad you're here with us, and we look forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's an honor to get this prize, and it's a great opportunity to present my work in progress to so many Kantians. So I'm going to share my screen now. Okay, great. Okay, hopefully you can see the handout. A copy of the handout should be also in the chat, so you can access that. Okay, great. So let me start by saying something about the framework for this project, for this paper titled A Kantian Account of Aesthetically Sublime Rage. So as many of you might know, there is a long tradition of scholars arguing in favor of the value and aptness of anger. Obviously, that tradition has started with Aristotle, but in contemporary ethical debates, this topic is usually analyzed within the context of feminist philosophy. And if one reads through that scholarship, is really clear that Kant is not one of the authors that is referenced when talking about anger. And this is somewhat unsurprising, because even within Kant's scholarship, it seems to be assumed that Kant has really nothing to say about anger other than it is an obstacle to proper reflection, and we have a duty to govern it, that is the duty of apathy. However, Kant's texts give us ground to think that Kant has more to say about this emotion, and that Kant can contribute to the current debate about anger in contemporary ethics, given that he claims that a certain kind of anger can be aesthetically sublime. This would be in the third critique. Now, I'm not the first one to point this out. Like some Kant scholars have pointed out that Kant treats some affects as aesthetically sublime. For instance, Henry Allison, Lara Dennis, Robert Lewis here. For instance, Robert focuses on enthusiasm. But I think that like a fully developed account of anger as aesthetically sublime is missing in the scholarship. Okay, so now to be clear on what I'm going to do here today, the plan for today, will lay the ground for the Kant's account of aesthetically sublime rage, starting from Kant's text. And I will not have much time to discuss the application of this account to the current debate, but keep in mind that that is one of the aim of the project. And I will hint at that here and there, but we don't have time to fully get into this, but we can talk about it in the Q&A if you want. Okay, so having said that, let us start with the main textual evidence for the claim that anger can be aesthetically sublime. In the first critique, Kant writes the following. He writes that every affect of the courageous sword, that is, which arouses the consciousness of our powers to overcome any resistance, is aesthetically sublime. For instance, anger, even despair, the enraged, not the despondent kind. Okay, a terminological note here. So Zorn is usually translated as anger in this context. However, I prefer the term rage. Why is that? Well, the reason is that translating Zorn with anger might tempt us to think that here Kant is talking about something like cool-headed moral disapprobation, some form of like detached attitude, but that is not the case. Kant clearly thinks that Zorn is an affect, and he treats affects as belonging to a special category of feeling. So, for instance, to give you a definition of affect that Kant put forth in the Anthropology, Kant tells us the following: the feeling of pleasure or displeasure in the subject's present state that does not let him rise to reflection, the representation by means of reason as to whether he should give himself up to it or refuse it, is affect. So here Kant tells us that affects are feelings that are obstacles to reflection. And even though it is not a constitutive characteristic of this feeling that they are impetuous, intense, and often short-lived, this is nonetheless a feature that they have. It's not a constitutive one, but it's a feature of them. So for this reason, I'm going to treat Zorn and translate it as rage rather than anger. Okay, so now the question is, what does Kant's claim that rage can be aesthetically sublime amount to? What does that mean? And I'm going to claim that aesthetically sublime rage is rage that one feels in response to a certain event, for instance, being subject to or witnessing injustice, when a free play between imagination and a moral idea takes place in one's mind, and the rage as a contemplative, not motivational function. Now, to give you a hint of how I want to develop this account of rage, I'm going to say that I take this kind of rage to have a distinctive social and political function, especially in context of injustice, that is not captured by the forms of anger that are discussed in the scholarship. Unlike other kinds of anger, aesthetically sublime rage does not help the subject achieve any end throughout the time that she's feeling the rage. And because of this, it escapes the problems that other kinds of anger face, like these problems. I'm not going to get into the details here, but these problems are very generally speaking that the anger might direct the agent's attention to the wrong kind of reasons and might display a certain inappropriate attitude of placing too much value on the dear self. Okay, so however, even though this aesthetically sublime rage does not play a motivational function, it can help the subject achieve and realize moral ends in the future when the rage is gone, and then the agent can properly reflect. Okay, so this is like in a nutshell how I want to apply the account. We're going to talk about some of these elements later, but I will not get into the contemporary debate. Okay, so let us break down the elements of aesthetically sublime rage. Like, let us first start with the sublimity of aesthetic rage. Here, what is important to notice is that Kant defines the sublime in this context as a stretching of the powers through ideas. What does that mean? Well, the main idea is that there is a free play between imagination and reason, whereby reason presents the imagination with an idea, and the imagination runs free trying to meet the reason's idea, and therefore is stretched by the possibilities on which it reflects. Now, like the idea at stake is the idea of reason, and Kant defines in the For Critique ideas of reason in the following way. These are ideas which only reason can think and to which no sensible intuition can be adequate. Now, obviously, Kantians are familiar with the notion of ideas of reason in the context of the First Critique, where Kant presents like the three main ideas of reason: the soul, the world whole, and God, obviously. But as many scholars have put forth, there are several ideas that serve at least a similar enough function. And these ideas can have a moral and political function, for instance, the idea of a just constitution, or the idea of a republic, or the idea of justice, and some others don't, like, for instance, poor earth, water, and air. In any case, in the experience of aesthetically sublime affects, Kant makes it clear that the idea of reason at stake is a moral idea. Now, it doesn't have to be justice, it can be something else, but justice is, I think, a paradigmatic example of what the relevant moral idea could be. Now, like, to say that a moral idea is a play here is to say that this aesthetic rage is a response to this moral idea. It is constrained by such idea, and this is what it means to say that it's sublime. Kant makes this clear in this note in the For Critique, when he writes that even that which we call sublime in nature, outside us or even within ourselves, for instance, certain affects, is represented only as a power of the mind to soar above certain obstacles of sensibility by means of moral principles. Okay, so now an important point to get is that when it comes to these ideas of reasons like justice, like, we can build different conceptions of them depending on how we think of their purpose, for instance, and their practical implications. And it is in the sense that they are somewhat indeterminate. So they are representation of objects for which we hope to find some rules, some laws. And they are heuristic tools through which we can find these laws. So like that, now this might sound like a skeptical claim. So they are indeterminate. So, like, how can we build the correct conception of it? But Kant's point is that we can indeed form a correct conception of these ideas. And in fact, he points out that sublime rage must accord with the morally right. This is in the conflict of the faculties, and not just be thought to so accord. And this tells us that one's rage is sublime only if it is a response to one's correct appreciation of the moral idea at stake and correct identification of what state of affairs constitutes an obstacle for the realization of that idea. Okay, I'm gonna take a sip of water. Now, this tells us that it might be tricky to say when one's appreciation of a certain moral idea at stake when feeling anger is correct or not. So, for instance, I'm going to provide two examples, like a case in which it's going to be easy to say when one's rage is sublime and grounded on a correct appreciation or not, is the following. So consider the white supremacists enraged at the thought that a black man is the president. So imagining this rage is aesthetic. The question is that, is it also sublime? I think that there's an easy answer to that. It's like, it's no, it's not, because like this person's idea of justice is clearly mistaken, since it's conceiving justice as something that must be at the expense of a certain social group for the benefit of another. However, it might be tricky in certain situations, in other examples, to figure out whether the conception of justice at stake is the correct one or not, and it might require a lot of evaluative reflection. So for instance, take the case in which one is enraged that in a workplace one's colleague is displaying a certain controversial political symbol. Like, imagine that this rage is aesthetic. Is it also sublime? Well, it's not clear. To answer this question, so there is an answer to this question, but to answer it, we need to evaluate, for instance, how justice is going to entail certain liberties, and to which extent, for instance, free speech. So it might be hard to figure out which rage is properly sublime or not. In any case, what this tells us, this is also an important point, is that when one's rage is sublime, one's rage is also apt. So the rage is the felt recognition of something that truly is an injustice. So there is this relation of fit between sublimity and aptness. So here I'm working with a notion of aptness that has been put forth in the contemporary literature, for instance, by M.A. Srinivasan, for which one's anger that P is apt only if P constitutes a genuine moral violation. In any case, the takeaway is that sublimity and aptness go hand in hand. And so, like, to distinguish between sublime and apt rage and not sublime and not apt rage, this might require some complex effort of evaluation when it comes to conception of a certain moral idea. Okay, so having said that, we can go to the second element of aesthetically sublime rage, so the aesthetic character of this rage. Now, to be clear, like, sublime rage is always aesthetic, but aesthetic rage is not always sublime. However, in this part of the talk, I will be concerned with the kind of aesthetic rage that is also sublime, and how the aesthetic character of the rage can be explained in relation to its sublimity. Okay, so what does it mean to say that this rage is aesthetic? Well, it means that the feeling of rage is not followed by a desire to bring about a certain object or state of affair. However, there is a complication, because in the Metaphysical Morals, Kant tells us that aesthetic feeling, like, can also come about when can also be followed by a desire. However, the pleasure here is not a bottom-up pleasure in the existence of an object, of a representation, but is attached only to the representation by itself. I find this a little bit obscure. And one reason for that is that it is hard to figure out exactly how the pleasure can be not in the existence of the object if the pleasure causes the desire, as Kant tells us in the introduction of the Metaphysics of Moral that it does. So I'm going to set aside this case for now and claim that the paradigmatic case of aesthetic feeling when it comes to aesthetic rage is a rage that is not followed by a desire. I will be interested in hearing your thoughts on how to explain the case in which the feeling is followed by a desire, but the feeling is not a pleasure in the existence of the object. In any case, I'm going to focus on the first case. Now, to say that aesthetic rage is not followed by a desire is to say that it is a mental state of the observer rather than of an agent. However, that doesn't imply that this observer is passive. Rather, like it's a very active observer in his like faculties, is very attuned to what is happening. And this means that aesthetically sublime rage does not motivate one to achieve any end from the time the subject is feeling rage. So the feeling is not followed by a desire to bring about a certain object or state of affair, and therefore it's not achieving any end. To give you an example, the kind of example that I like to give here is the following. So imagine watching the news and seeing a recorded clip of police brutality motivated by racial prejudice, for instance. Like it makes sense to say that the observer there is enraged, but is not really doing anything. Like there's nothing for you to do. You are simply an observer. Now, obviously, one might, I don't know, gasp or make an angry face, but I take that to be expressive behavior rather than action proper. So I'm kind of like thinking of a distinction between action proper and expressive behavior. But yeah, that would be an example of what I'm talking about. Okay, so even though aesthetic rage, aesthetically sublime rage, does not motivate actively the agent to do something here and now, it can have an indirect future directive motivational function. And in fact, it can help us achieve and realize some ends in the future when the rage is gone, it subsides, and proper reflection kicks in. Now, there are several ways in which aesthetically sublime rage can do that. The first one is that it can reveal to us that we deeply care about these moral ideas. So it's obvious that we have these ideas, but it might not be something we are conscious of all the time, that we care deeply about this idea. We care about justice, for instance. And as such, aesthetically sublime rage can help us keep a sustained focus on these ideas and the fact that we care about them, even when the feeling is gone. And I think that that is an important component of trying to achieve some form of like moral progress. Second, as an effective response to a moral idea, aesthetically sublime rage can put us in a special position to recognize instances in which this idea is being realized or not realized. And it can do so by sparking inquiry concerning whether the state of affair that has elicited the rage constitutes a realization or a departure from that idea. So it helps us start to inquire about what has happened. And how that fits with this moral idea that we have. Moreover, someone feeling aesthetically sublime rage in reply to injustice might further reflect on what justice requires, how this idea contributes to human moral progress, and what needs to be done in order to pursue this progress. And as such, it is a morally encouraging sign. And finally, this rage prepares us to value something against our self-centered interest. In fact, feeling or expressing this kind of rage might go against one's interest, because one can be marginalized, diminished, or oppressed for doing so. And as such, this kind of rage can help us bridge the gaps between different social interest groups. And on a more Kantian note, it can experiencing this kind of rage prepare us to experience conflicts between our self-centered interest and the demands of morality. Okay, so now, like that, we have laid out the basic account. So there is more to say, but this is like the basics. I want to end the talk by focusing on an exegetical puzzle that we can find in Kant's text regarding rage and apathy. Okay, so the puzzle is the following. So Kant clearly tells us that rage can be aesthetically sublime, but at the same time, he also writes the following. affectlessness, apatheia, in a mind that emphatically pursues its own inalterable principles is sublime, and indeed in a far superior way. Okay, so here apathy is defined as a state of mind that is free of affects, as Kant tells us also in the Metaphysics of Morals. And you might ask, well, what is valuable about this apathy? And I think that the idea is that, according to Kant, a state of mind that is apathetic is valuable because it helps us acting from duty. It helps us focusing on the right kind of reasons for action rather than being tempted by other incentives to act from those incentives rather than from duty. So that is what is important about apathy. Now, given this, how should we make sense of the claim that apathy is more sublime than aesthetically sublime rage? Well, one possible line of reply here is that aesthetically sublime affects like rage are not properly sublime, so they're not really sublime. They're just fraudulent modes of the sublime. So this line of interpretation has been put forth, for instance, by Melissa Merritt, who writes the following: what is aesthetically sublime in this sense, so for these affects is meant, works as over-inducing an agreeable exhaustion that Kant likens to having one's muscles and joints work over by a masseur. It does not exercise the freedom that is proper of a rational being. So I think that this interpretation is not the correct one, however, and I think that that is clear from Kant's text. Take the following passage. Here, Kant is talking about enthusiasm, but the claim that he's making can be also extended to sublime rage. I'm not going to read the passage, but briefly summarize it here. So Kant, but you can look at the passage, of course, in the handout. So here Kant starts by defining enthusiasm as the idea of the good with affects, and he claims that the state of mind just seems to be sublime. He's not telling us that it's sublime. He's saying it seems sublime. And then he considers the worry that enthusiasm is an affect, and affects are movement of the mind that makes it incapable of engaging in free considerations of principles. So they are obstacles of reflection. However, should we conclude that enthusiasm only seems to be sublime without actually being sublime? The answer seems to be no. Kant clearly rejects this position, since he writes that nonetheless, enthusiasm is aesthetically sublime. I'm emphasizing here the is. Why is that? Well, the reason is that the characteristic of the state of mind are those of proper sublimity. Enthusiasm is a stretching of the powers through idea, which gives the mind a momentum that acts far more powerfully and persistently than the impetus given by sensory representation. So it is the right fit, is sublime. And the same can be said about sublime rage. So I'm going to conclude from this that we should take Kant at his word and actually hold that aesthetically sublime rage is actually sublime. Okay, so, but then how do we solve the puzzle? Well, we are left with two other possible lines of inquiry. The first one is just to point out that when Kant praises apathy here, he's really emphasizing the fact that this kind of rage does not and should not have a motivational function. He's saying, yeah, it's okay to feel this kind of rage, but really it should not motivate you. It's only aesthetically sublime. The other line of reply, which I find to be a little deeper, is that points out that apathy is more sublime, but in a way that is not suitable for us. And this position has been put forth, for instance, by Lara Dennis in her 2000 paper. So the idea here is that, so key for understanding this claim is to figure out that when Kant praises apathy as more sublime, he's praising the Stoic sage. This is clear from several texts, for instance, the Anthropology or the Metaphysics of Morals. So, for instance, in the Anthropology, Kant writes that the principle of apathy, that is, that the wise man must at no time be in a state of affect, not even in that of sympathy with the woes of his best friend, is an entirely correct and sublime moral precept of the Stoic school. And then we have the infamous passage in the Metaphysics of Morals in which Kant writes the following: "It was a sublime way of thinking that the Stoic ascribed to his wise man, that he had him say, I wish for a friend, not that he might help me in poverty, sickness, imprisonment, etc., but that I might stand by him and rescue a man. But this same wise man, when he could not rescue his friend, said to himself, what is it to me? In other words, he rejected compassion." This is quite an infamous example. But what is important to notice about this passage is that yes, Kant is praising the Stoic sage, and to say that the apathy of the Stoic sage is sublime is a very high praise. However, praising the Stoic sage and his apathy as sublime does not mean that Kant is endorsing fully the apathy of the Stoic sage. In fact, Kant indicates that the Stoics have a quite unrealistic understanding of human nature. For instance, Kant writes in the Second Critique that the Stoics exaggerated the moral capacities of the human being under the name of sage beyond all the limits of our knowledge of human beings. And in fact, they refuse to recognize that personal happiness is a special object of human desire, even though the voice of their own nature could have sufficiently refuted this. And this is one of the main reasons why Kant thinks that the Stoics just get the highest good wrong. Okay, so the giveaway here is that apathy is not suitable as a state of mind for being like us, but aesthetically sublime rage is. It is a suitable state of mind for human beings, for being like us, and is not objectionable in this sense. Okay, so I'm gonna end here. Yeah, and maybe we can start the Q&A. Okay, I'll stop sharing.
Okay, thank you so much for that wonderful presentation. We do have a few minutes for questions. I see 3 hands. Maybe we'll allow 3 questions, and then again, we can continue it in the informal part. And all of the hands just went away, amazingly. So I don't know who.
I think we were clapping.
Okay, so Helga's hand is up.
Hi, yeah, thank you so much for that wonderfully interesting presentation. I had just one little suggestion maybe along the way as a means of illustration, and see if you agree with it. So you talked about how, you know, the problem of when sort of what seems to be happening is aesthetic rage or sublime rage, but it would be tracking the wrong things, right? And I'm wondering if you're sympathetic to this rendering of that. And I think you can back it up with an interpretation of the propensity to evil, but I'm not going to do it now. But I find it quite interesting that Michelle Obama, she's famous for saying, you know, when they go low, we go high. And she was interviewed by Oprah on this particular point. On going low and high, and Oprah saying, do you mean like going high right away, you know, holding up the moral standard that we strive to be? And Michelle Obama said, no, not at all. You know, what I do at home at the kitchen table is to go low, like to be upset. What you could then argue is rage. But once I, you know, reassume my public position and uphold the moral ideal for kids and for everyone who listens to me because I'm a public person, then I go high. And I'm thinking that that is perhaps exactly what you are after, because that's what the white supremacists cannot do. They cannot also describe their upsetness and then holding up what we need to strive towards in terms of language that is consistent with the dignity of each human being, or the right to freedom for each people, each human being, or what America should be all about. So I'm wondering if that could be one way for you to illustrate your argument. Just a suggestion.
Yeah, thank you. This is interesting, and I think that this is getting the picture right in a sense. So maybe one thing that I want to say is that so aesthetically sublime rage. So when the aesthetic rage is sublime, it means that we are having a correct appreciation. Otherwise, it would only be aesthetic rage without it being sublime. So this is just to make up precision about my point. So yeah, about your suggestion, I would say that it's important to notice how aesthetically sublime rage is like an affective responses, right, to something that is an injustice, and in that sense can be considered going low. It does require, in a certain sense, a judgment that something is an injustice, but the agent might not be conscious of having made that judgment in a sense. So in a certain sense, the rage is an heuristic tool for finding out how we are judging things. And so in that sense, it can be a starting point for figuring out what our conscious evaluative perspective about things is. And so I like the metaphor saying it's starting low and then proceeding high. So yeah, thanks for the suggestion, Helga.
I'm going to sneak in one more, but if Kant's conception of as I think it is, the propensity to evil. So once you get to depravity, then you will you're always self-deceived, and you will always use moralized language, i.e., it's not an accident that once you really morally lose your way, say as white supremacist KKK kind of thing, then they will mimic the aesthetically sublime, right? And that's how they bring themselves to do it emotionally. Now I'll stop.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, and of course, then reflective evaluation should bring them to realize that their aesthetic rage is not sublime, and they're failing to do that. Yeah, and it's a rational failure. Yeah, thank you.
Ephraim?
Yeah, it's a great presentation, and thank you very much. It opens up things that were close to me up till now. So thinking about this passage, it's an explanatory passage of the Perpetual Peace. Is the third definitive article, and Kant there says something to the effect that a violation of justice or right in one part of the world is felt in all other parts of the world. So what would that feeling would that feeling qualify as rage? Would that qualify as non-sublime aesthetic rage? That it's a very peculiar concept, if I understood it correctly. So yeah, that is the question, and because if you answer yes, then my next question would be, how come that feeling is not tied to action, even to motivation for action and for changing things in the world, something like that? Thanks a lot. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. So I'm not familiar with this passage, or at least I'm not remembering it right now off the top of my head, but definitely I'm gonna look it up. So it seems to me that the passage is pointing at a feeling that might unite different people, maybe, when it comes to responding to injustice. Is that the idea? Yes. Then
Exactly. Yes.
Okay, yeah, great. That it might be, aesthetically sublime rage might be, might be a candidate for what the feeling might look like. now, when it comes to motivation, so first of all, there is that caveat about the fact that aesthetically sublime rage may be a feeling that is accompanied by a desire, but the feeling of pleasure is not a pleasure in the existence of the object, but only attached to the representation of the object, even though I'm still working that through. So it might have a motivational function, but a very peculiar one that is deprived of the, a motivation that is based on the feeling of pleasure related to the existence of the object. I'm going to leave it here. What I'd like to say is that maybe it is mistaken to think that aesthetically sublime rage as an aesthetic reaction that does not help us achieve any end here and now is not helpful for fighting injustice, because there are several reasons. So some of the reason I've given by saying, hey, it can help you later on in the future, and maybe in a better way, given that those ends that you're going to pursue in the future are ends that you are reflectively endorsing and thinking about possibly in the right way. Whereas if you would be motivated by anger here and now, there's a high chance that you might, engage with the wrong kind of considerations for achieving those ends. But also, like, if even thinking about, like the rage not motivating you here and now to pursue any end, it is important to notice, I think, that feeling or expressing a certain feeling motivated by a conception of justice is already in itself a form of resistance. And it's treated as such, for instance, in certain debates in feminist philosophy. So already feeling this stuff is enough for awakening you to a sense of justice. So it's enough for doing some work for realizing a certain form of moral progress, even though it's not concrete in the realization of certain end here and now. So I hope this helps. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much, Martina. Thank you for the presentation. And thank you to each of our speakers. So this will conclude the official part of our session here. But again, you're invited to continue the conversation informally. So thank you again, and goodbye.